Oh, right.
Okay. Yeah, it's happening. It's recording.
It's happening. Okay, magic. Uh, Thanks to Priyanka. Priyanka wants you to know that it's okay. A wide range of disciplinary foci covering research interest in South Asia, including development studies, medieval and modern, and in fact also contemporary history, sociology, economy, geography, gender studies, political science, and I might be forgetting one or two, of course. This is the 15th and last session of this seminar series of this academic year. Um, we have had a lot of distinguished contributors, panelists, and we're really thankful to them. But we're also thankful to those who made this seminar possible behind the scene. In particular, Clément Cellier, Niru Gohar, and Samuel Ben Kimoun were instrumental to make this seminar series a success. But today we have Dr. Christophe. I
Neusiedl.
apologize for the pronunciation of your
It's
last name,
difficult.
but Neusiedl. Please correct me.
Getting there.
Okay. Who will be speaking today about alternative education in India, and about, of course, the challenges of modern education and inequality that sparks from the current system of education in many Indian states. It will be using quite a bit of critical theory to engage with the topic, in particular prefigurative politics, and Jacques Rancière's body of work, and in particular his notion of radical equality. Few words about the speaker today. Um, Christophe obtained his PhD in Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong in 2019. His doctoral dissertation received a prestigious prize called City University Outstanding Research Award. He has, of course, extensive experience and research in the field of education, in particular alternative education in India. Um, he, his work is deeply interdisciplinary and is published in a wide range of journals, including Third World Quarterly. So we are really happy to have him for our last session of this year before we reconvene sometime next term in October or November. Dr. Christophe Neusiedl, if you would like to step in and give what we are all aware will be a fantastic presentation. The floor is yours, and those who have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat box, or to since it's also a conversation, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question to the presenter. Christophe, the mic
Yeah.
is yours.
Thanks a lot, Sean Thomas, for this nice introduction. And yeah, before I start, let me also briefly thank everyone here. Of course, thanks to the CSH team for organizing this lecture series, especially to Niru and to Sean Thomas for organizing this. And Nicola, I've seen he's here. Also, thanks to you for yeah, welcoming me a couple of years back as a visiting PhD researcher at CSH. So good to see you. yeah, and that's also, I think, why I'm quite happy to have this session with you today, because it yeah, pretty much coincides with the launch of the Indian edition of my book, Revolutions in Learning and Education from India, which is pretty much and largely based on my PhD research over the last few years. Now 45 minutes quite a short time actually to go through a whole book, but on the other hand, it's a very long time to really keep everyone's attention. So what I'm trying to do is to focus on a few things, like two case studies of modern education in India and of alternative education in India, and yeah, focus on the educational part of it. Whereas my book, in case you have seen it, it deals like really with a lot of different kind of fields of research and theories, from post-development to pluriversal studies, ecofeminism, anarchist and post-anarchist political theory. And overall, it's rooted in what I would call the philosophy of development and the philosophy of um, education. And I think I want to start with just giving you an idea about where my research in particular is rooted, which is, like I said, transdisciplinary, but at the point of departure is really post-development theory. And post-development asks basically for alternatives to development instead of alternative development. And one of my goals in this book is actually to examine how can education and learning help us to build those post-developmental alternatives. How can education and learning become a tool for a new kind of development, or rather for thinking beyond development. Now, to understand where I come from, I just want to give you a little bit of introduction to post-development theory. So if you look at the whole range of development theories out there, post-development is really almost outside the box, because it basically rejects the entire concept and practice of development. It does that out of two main reasons. One is the sort of what we can call the material side of things, so looking at the negative impact that development has created and still creates on local communities, the new problems arising with development interventions and with this model of development, from new challenges in for the environment to new challenges in healthcare, new forms of modern poverty, indebtedness, and so on. And on the other side, we have the what I would call the discursive or conceptual side of things. Now, here, basically, post-development argues that development is a sort of very hierarchical, technical, top-down process, which is promoting a very narrow, a very subjective version of what actually makes a good life, which is very much based on a Western role model of modernization, industrialization, consumerism, individualism, and so on, and takes this as universally applicable and also universally desirable. And it also portrays development as a sort of neo-colonial tool, which in a more subtle way perpetuates that dependence from developing countries on so-called developing countries. So it shows how, in a way, that idea of civilizing the uncivilized during the colonial time has been evolved in a more subtler way in the development paradigm into the concept of developing the underdeveloped. And in the first part of my book, which largely deals with with the philosophy of development, I draw on this theory, and I'm adding to that theory some more understandings. And basically, how I make sense of development today is basically that although it promises development, and although it promises equality, or in other words, it promises to make everyone equally developed, what development actually does, it is taking away people's choice to pursue their own ideas of what constitutes meaningful lives for them. So again, while development basically promises to bring equality to everyone, making everyone equally developed, it does so in a rather very subjective and very narrow way. So the one and only equality that development today basically offers is to become equals before the market. So meaning having equal access to markets, finance, products, and the opportunities that the market offers. And so that's why I come from the perspective of post-development, which again argues for alternatives to development. And it makes the case for both this material side of things. It, for instance, also shows recent research has, for instance, shown that for the case of India, neoliberal development has actually, far from enabling the benefits of its growth rates to trickle down to all groups, it has actually further entrenched inequalities based on pre-existing unequal social divisions. And the question for me was that despite all of this, despite all those really well-documented shortcomings and failures and so on of development as usual, why is it that we are not changing the model? Like the answer seems to be always more development and intensification nowadays of the neoliberal development agenda, instead of actually thinking out of the box. And especially post-development scholars also show how this whole core tenets of development, so say the primacy of economic growth, the importance of the private sector and private sector-led growth, the reign of free markets, the ideals of consumerism, individualism, and so on. You still find that even in the sustainable development agenda, in the sustainable development goals, which again tries to sort of square the circle by reconciling economic growth with protecting the environment, stopping climate change, and so on. And that is really the question for me, which was the point of departure of the book. So how come we are still stuck in that thinking? And there's that now very often used, probably too often used quote from Frederick Jameson, who said that nowadays it's basically easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And that is really something that that puzzles me. And because of that, what I wanted to do in my research is looking at what is the role of education in all this, and how can education on one side, and this is what I'm arguing first, how is modern education, particularly the modern schooling system, more or less a very effective tool to help maintain this status quo. But how can education also be a different approach to education, also become a tool to overcome this thinking about development, and to help us to reimagine development and think beyond development. And this is basically what I'm doing in my book. I'm analyze both the roles of education in contemporary India for, let's say, recreating, reinforcing the current capitalist development paradigm. And on the other side, I'm looking at some of the initiative of alternative education or holistic education that are also out there in India, and how they can help us to think, to reimagine development. In the first part, I argue, and this is also what I'm talking about now for the next 15-20 minutes. In the first part, I argued that mainstream education basically does not only reflect our contemporary society, and by that the hegemonic status quo, but it actively helps to recreate and therefore perpetuate this status quo, and keeps on rebuilding it. And it does so by molding or shaping students into what I call good consumer citizens, who will more or less obediently accept, it is envisioned, their pre-assigned roles within the dominant model of development. Now, today in India, how this is happening mainly is this molding of students as good consumer citizens is according to the current neoliberal development model. And I'm trying to show in the book that really, if we look at the trends in education in India, but also beyond, what we can see is that language and that approach of neoliberal development is really getting into the whole education landscape and fundamentally changing our idea and our concept of education. I start by showing in the book how the Indian state nowadays is becoming more and more a market maker for education. When before the state was envisaged as a service provider whose task it is to give education to everyone, especially for the ones who can't afford to go to private schools. Now this role has shifted into becoming a market maker together with the private sector, with the non-profit sectors, especially philanthropies, as I will show, and also in collaboration with key development actors such as the World Bank, which still is the most important donor for education projects in India. So my argument here is that the state advances a business agenda of education together with all those other actors. They advance a business agenda of education as well as in education, while at the same time they also build a market ecosystem for additional services. And in effect, what this means is that education, which is has been, along with healthcare, one of the last market frontiers, so to speak, has really been fully subjected to market relations nowadays. So what I mean by those different agendas, I just briefly talk about this. First of all, business agenda of the education system. By that, I mean education basically as creating consumer citizens for the capitalist development model. And I'm getting into a case study in a while to show how that works in practice. By a business agenda in the education system, what I mean by that is how the state has been supporting private education systems and private education service providers to the detriment of public schooling. And I also make the case in my book to trace a bit the history of funding for public education. While this has never been a priority of the Indian government, you can see how with the structural adjustment programs of the 1990s that have been introduced, this has even been further reduced, and it has also been accompanied by a by a campaign to sort of make the public believe in the failure of the public education system and make them choose by default, if they have any options, to choose for the and go for the private education sector. And lastly, when I talk about a business agenda for education-related private companies and service providers, by that I mean, for instance, the building of infrastructure, providing services, including giving loans to schools, the creation of data analysis and various IT software to measure performance and also to control students as well as teachers, selling new and apparently more effective pedagogies and learning and teaching methods, We can also see how the private tutoring business is prospering and has become a billion-dollar business in India. So those are the things which I address in my book when I say that nowadays education is more and more and really for roughly subjected to market relations. And what I focus on is, so to speak, the newest story or the newest development in this, which is the pretty dramatic increase of public-private partnerships in education, or EPPPs in short. Now, the widespread introduction of those EPPPs plays really an important role, I argue, in the attempts of development actors to create and increase dependency on the market in the education sector, as well as far beyond. And how is this done? Basically, educational stakeholders, so in particular parents and their children, so students, they are enlisted by public-private partnerships through the encouraged perception of public school failure. And moreover, they are not only recruited into those market-mediated solutions, but they are also simultaneously directed away from making demands onto the state, making demands for money, for support, and so on. So this introduction of EPPPs involves both a structural reorientation towards the privatization of education and the simultaneous cultivation of individuals as choice-making subjects, which again is a key theme of neoliberal theory. Now, the irony with this mantra of choice that allegedly now parents and students have much more choice and so on when it comes to their education is actually that the increased commercialization, the increased neoliberalization of education is basically a consequence of the structural destruction of the public education system, which, if you look at it in effect, has actually decreased and taken away whatever limited choice was available till then. And what I'm looking at in particular is how over the last years, philanthropic organizations have become some of the biggest promoters and some of the biggest actors in public-private partnerships for education. So they're forming various partnerships with governments as well as with for-profit and non-profit organizations. One important player in India in particular is philanthropy or a philanthropic organization called Absolute Return for Kids. In short, it's called ARK or ARC. It is a British-based education charity, which you could probably guess from that very creative name, was founded by two hedge fund managers. It has operations in the UK, in the US, in Uganda, and also in India, particularly in Delhi. The Indian schools they operate, they have been recently rebranded under the name of People, like the People Tree. But for now, as like in my book, I'll just refer to them as ARK schools. So they are still managed by them and under them, but have just changed their names. Now, when I did my research about their operations in India, they operated 3 model schools in Delhi under this EPPP model. Those schools were former public schools that have been singled out as failing schools for various reasons by the South Delhi Municipal Corporation. They offer preschool and they offer primary school until grade 5. Now, the first thing, and yeah, what I should say is they are specifically targeted for members from marginalized communities and for people from socioeconomic difficult backgrounds, and they have been specifically enticed to go to that school. There were also experiments with school voucher systems and so on. So apart from that, what stands out for me in the school is that they have an exclusive focus on Hindi, English, and maths, like a strong and exclusive focus on those three subjects, and which for me just demonstrates the further reduction of education to what is nowadays often proudly referred by schools and by development actors as minimum learning outcomes. So you will often hear this minimum learning outcomes, which really makes me wonder why is this so prominently used, and I guess it's not a term that you would hear so much in middle and upper class school as a target. And I think it is very much related to that idea that for the poor, for the marginalized, all they need is basically minimum learning outcomes, meaning a basic set of skills to become productive workers according to what the market currently demands. Paul Marshall, he is one of the founder of ARK, one of the two hedge fund billionaires. He explained in an interview that at ARK, we demonstrated if you set high expectations, robust discipline, and you focus relentlessly on literacy and numeracy, then poor children can achieve as well as prosperous ones. Now, what does that tell us again from that interview? First of all, it implies there is a need for schools only for the poor, and that poor children basically need more discipline than prosperous children, that they're not able to learn on their own, nor do they possess any knowledge, skills, and education yet. So again, this sort of alleged backwardness of poor children then really justifies the operations of such dedicated schools for the poor, where they learn, like I said, only the basic skills they need in order to serve as cheap labor, on which the current development model, the capitalist development model, obviously depends. Now, those schools for the poor, and this is also a term which is used by ARK and so on, they do not only come in the case of ARK with a special curriculum for the poor, but also with a special pedagogy for the poor. In India, ARK has used what it calls a behavior management system, or BMS. And ARC celebrates, for instance, on its website, there's an entry which celebrates as a transformation in behavior, I quote here, that thanks to the introduction of this behavior management system, children started to line up, wait for their turn, follow class rules, and engage in collaborative study and play. Again, what you can see here is that in those schools, which are, by the way, modeled after the ARK academies in the United Kingdom, there clearly is a very strong emphasis on discipline and on behavior management, which is seen as pivotal, and which I argue in my book very much goes towards that goal of that kind of education, to produce subservient, obedient, productive workers who only need the basic skills and don't need any traits of critical thinking or anything else in this line. Again, I quickly want to quote Paul Marshall, the co-founder of ARK. In another interview, he, for instance, also said that the only way for head teachers to reverse underperforming schools is if they quote, so that's a quote, first of all, sort behavior. What we can see here, I also argue, is a latent class bias, which sees poor children in need of military and corporate style strong leadership. So this is one element which becomes very obvious in those schools. And another element that stood out from me, and that again goes directly to recreating the conditions for a neoliberal development, that is how business and how entrepreneurship-like norms and behaviors, which follow that market mantra of a choice, are really embedded in the daily school pedagogy by applying forms of productive power. This becomes evident, for instance, in that following quote that I want to read out to you, which comes from the ARC India head of school, who I interviewed for my research. Now, he said, it's a bit of a long quote, so please bear with me, but I think it's interesting to hear it out in full. He says basically that what we train our teachers to do is to use something called positive reinforcement. So as an organization, we believe in behavior for learning, not behavior for disciplining. Again, which I would to a certain degree doubt, looking at the above what I've just said. But in any way, so he continues to say, so this is a big difference in our pedagogy. I'm not going to ask the student to do this just because I am 10 times bigger than the student and I'm the adult and you should follow me. You should want to do that instead. You should want to follow me. You should see the merit in doing that. And you should understand, and here is also where I think it becomes interesting, you should understand that your choices have consequences. So that's the premise we believe in. Everything, he says, is choice-based in our school. Then he went on to show me a behavior tracker, which is a tool that is used and prominently displayed in every class. And he explains this behavior tracking system. So it basically has 4 phases. On the top of it, you see a star. Then secondly, below it, there comes a smiley face. Then it becomes a neutral face. And then it becomes a sad face. And so all kids, when they come in the morning, they are being told they are stars. All their names are stuck at the top. And then at the beginning of the day, the teacher always reminds the students, we start the day, so all of you are stars. And then, and this is what the teacher, what the ARK head of schools told me, then it is up to the students. If they make smart choices, they stay a star. If they make not so smart choices, they will be coming down. And so I went to one first grade class to observe this a little bit. And I was really very much surprised by how frequently and how prominently that tracking tool was basically used by the teacher. So already after a few minutes into the first class, some children would be started to be graded down by the teacher. 2 of the children were reaching the lowest phase, which is the sad phase, within the very first 1 hour of the class. Which in effect meant a reduction of their playtime as punishment, which they in any way very generously allow to take place for 30 minutes every day only. And the teacher in the class, according to my observations, would continuously stress in between that how it is each child's own choice where they would end up on the tracking tool. So this was something that terminology that was very consciously used by the teachers. And this strong emphasis on choice in the pedagogy here then further reflects what we can see as the move of the development model from the individual as a citizen to the individual as a consumer or as a customer who is basically expected to act in all settings and in all circumstances according to the principles of rational choice theory. Now, choice, like I said also earlier, is a key component of neoliberalism because it rests on ideas of both individual freedom and individual responsibility. So basically the freedom to choose one thing over another and to be held accountable for that choice. This again is seen as sort of promoting entrepreneurial character traits by promoting cost-benefit calculations and making strategic investments based on informed decisions making. And last but not least, the last point I want to draw on here is Other forms of productive power, which are also employed in the ARK pedagogy, which essentially boil down to the introduction of individual competition across really all spheres of the school life. And that kind of competition, we all live in a dog eats dog world. Only the best will manage to make something out of their lives and so on, is of course also, and that whole ideal of competition is of course also a key mantra of neoliberal development. So to illustrate how this looks like in the ARK pedagogy, I want to give you another quote from my interview with the ARK head of school, which really shows how competition is encouraged and incentivized on all levels. So according to the head of schools, ARK provides, he says, a tremendous amount of opportunities in the class to appreciate kids. So that is the understanding of it. It's just an appreciation of kids. So he says that there are teams, each team gets points, each student has a pouch in the class, and they collect coupons. The students get coupons for every time they are doing well, and at the end of the day, we count who has the most, and they are then the student of the day. At the end of the week, we count who has the most, and they become the student of the week. We put their picture outside the classroom. We also have a best class trophy. So in the corridors outside, there's also a tracker, which is a simple bar graph. He continues to say, your class can earn stickers for walking down to playtime quietly and coming back without disturbing anyone else. At the end of the month, whosoever's bar graph is the tallest, they get the best class trophy in front of the whole school, and that trophy sits in your class for 1 month. We also have school values. We use an acronym called REACH: respect, exploration, achievement, courage, and honesty. At the end of each month, we pick 3 students from each class that have shown these values, and we appreciate them in front of the whole school by giving them certificates. So here you can see, I think at least I feel how competition really has gone to the next level and really pervades everything in the school on an everyday basis, and therefore recreates or actively reproduces the current neoliberal development models. Now, all of this is, like I said, intended to make students feel as if they are in a race against each other. There are only few winners and many losers, and it sort of incentivizes children to become individualistic, hyper-competitive human beings in what is really portrayed as a hyper-competitive world that is out there and awaits the children. And so I find this a very worrying trend in India, which only seems to accelerate. You can see key development actors such as the World Bank playing a crucial role here. They have just started a new program called STARS, which stands for Strengthening Teaching, Learning, and Results for States program, which explicitly draws on the charter school model and encourages the introduction of more EPPPs and so on. And we can also find this emphasis in the new national education policy of 2020, which further pushes for an increase in those EPPPs. And organizations such as ARK or ARK, what I argue in my books, with their questionable understanding of education that is rooted in a quantifiable minimum learning outcomes and in a likewise very questionable pedagogy that is embedded in clearly neoliberal values, they stand to benefit the most from these worrying trends. So that is one part of my book, which goes into how the modern education system, and in particular schooling, which is where I focus my critique and my assessment, is sort of recreating the neoliberal development model and sort of doesn't really prepare the students of the next generation to think out of the box, to come up with new solutions that we would really need, but only to, basically cement and perpetuate the status quo. From here, I want to talk about what education also can be. How can we look differently at education as a tool for empowering people to create their own ideas of what makes meaningful lives, which might be or would be largely outside that hegemonic and dominant model of development. So I continue with this part. To look at this, what I have done is basically, here I was drawing a lot on the political philosophy of Jacques Rancière, which I locate in that area of anarchist philosophy of education. Rancière himself, he doesn't call himself an anarchist, but I argue also in this book that his position is very close or very much part of a broader anarchist philosophy of education. Now, in particular, I'm drawing on his principle of the presupposition of equality. This principle basically says that everyone is equally intelligent and therefore everyone is able to create their own meaningful lives alongside each other. That is at least my interpretation of that principle of equality. So before I get a bit more into how can this principle actually be applied for what I want to call a post-developmental education, I want to talk a bit more about how Rancière has developed this principle. How does he actually come to the conclusion that everyone is, as he alleges, equally intelligent, and what does that mean? Because I think for many, this sounds very, very abstract and also very, maybe very wrong. So what does he actually mean by that? Basically, he sets up, or he develops this principle in his 1991 book, which is called The Ignoring Schoolmaster. Now, in that book, he coins the figure of the ignorant schoolmaster after Joseph Cousteau, who is a 19th century teacher from France who got exiled to Flanders. Now, he doesn't speak French. Sorry, he doesn't speak Flemish. He does speak French, and his students don't speak French, but they speak Flemish only. So, what to do? He basically made a virtue out of necessity by finding a dual language edition of a book, which then has become a thing in common between himself and his students. So basically a book which on one side of the page you will see the text in Flemish, on the other side you will see it in French. And then with the help of the translator, Jacques Cousteau has asked his students to read the bilingual book, read it again and again until they could write to him in French what they had actually understood. And to his very own surprise, his students were actually really able to make sense of what they had submitted and of what they had read, and they submitted very insightful and good quality work, which stunned himself the most. Now, to Jacques Cousteau and to Rancière, this experiment showed that his mastership, so to speak, it was not connected to his superior intelligence. It was not connected in a way that he offered access to knowledge to any of his students, right? He had basically not transferred any knowledge to the students like in the conventional model of education. What he did was he gave a command, right? He asked the students to read something, to work on something that was a thing in common between him and his students. So what he had done basically was to support his students' will to learn. And based on this, he announced to his students that he had nothing to teach them, he had no knowledge to transfer them, but all intelligences are equal, and they could learn whatever they want to do. And that basically led him to that insight of the equality of all intelligence. And I propose to take this as a key principle and as the point of departure for any kind of educational models, which help us to, in effect, which help us to rather think about the end of capitalism than the end of the world, which help us to create our own ideas of what constitutes meaningful lives. Now, before I go more into that, just let me clarify one thing. What does Rancière actually mean when he talks about the equality of intelligence? So he does not mean good for all of us. I think that we are all equally capable of scoring the same on any kind of exams, that we would just like this be equally good in any kind of A levels or other kind of exams in any and every subject. What he means is more basic. He means basically that we can all talk to another, we can all reason with one another, and based on this, on this reasoning based on our own reflections, we all together can construct meaningful lives on that basis. So while, of course, our specific intellectual skills, they may differ from one another, we are all equally capable of using those skills. We are using them to communicate, to interpret the world, to discuss, to make decisions and act on the basis of all this. And that is why I'm interpreting that presupposition of equal intelligence, in effect, as the presupposition that everyone is capable of building a meaningful life in interaction and alongside with others. And I think this has to be the key for any kind of learning and education outside the mainstream schooling system, to help us come up with new answers, find new solutions of how we want to construct our lives in the future. Now, in assuming that everyone is already and always equally intelligent from the outset, what Rancière's approach does is basically, it is becoming a performative practice, which only verifies that equality. And that act of verification of the equal intelligence is performed through the figure of the ignorant schoolmaster, who exactly presupposes equality of their students. So the central task for the ignorant schoolmaster in this model is not to enlighten the students and teach them what they don't know, as we have it in conventional models of education and schooling, right? In mainstream education, it's always a hierarchical relationship between the more or less all-knowing teacher and the students who don't know anything and have to be enlightened, right? Instead, Rancière's model turns around the whole model. It is to assume the students' equal intelligence and just see where it leads to. So we don't need to prove that they are equally intelligent. We just need to start with that as a basic assumption, and then see where it leads to. So this is then reconfigured as a relationship between equal intelligences, the relationship between the teacher and the student, which is why he calls the teacher rather the ignorant schoolmaster. And this verification of equality, how does it basically work? In effect, it's a process of making the student aware of their equal intelligence and of encouraging the student to actually use their equal intelligence accordingly. Now, the ignorant schoolmaster's first and foremost task then is basically to encourage and nurture the will of their learners. So to get them out of the belief that they are inferior, out of what Rancière is calling the swamp of self-contempt that leads them to think about themselves as less equal, and hence, I argue, prevents them from any kind of direct action and active participation in the construction of their own lives. Instead, they just accept their pre-given roles within the dominant development model. And so I'm arguing in my book that only by acting out of that presupposition of equality, we can actually have an education that supports students in, in critical thinking, in coming up with new ways of living, of being, of thinking, of feeling, and so on. And this is the cornerstone, I argue, to think about new models of development or models that go beyond development. Now, of course, we cannot just empower or emancipate others simply by telling them they are equal, or we can't demand them to act as equals, right? That would be pretty counterproductive. What is needed is that the ones who are considered less equal than others, which are those who, through the mainstream school system, through community, through society in general, have a feeling of their own inequality, they need to get a practical experience, and more than one, of their own equality. And this is the essence of an educational model based on the presupposition of equality. So it is the creation of spaces and of platforms in which the learners are able to apply their equal intelligence to concrete learning projects that matter to them. That is what I argue is a post-developmental education, what it should look like. So again, the creation of spaces and platforms in which the learners can apply their equal intelligence to concrete learning projects that matter to them. And I argue also that this form of post-developmental education is already in existence. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, or we don't have to come up with something completely new. We can see that, especially in India, but also elsewhere, in the growing unschooling movement. Sometimes this is also referred to self-designed learning or to free learning. And in my book, I look at different forms and approaches these models of unschooling are taking in India. One case I'm looking at is called Creativity Adda, which is interestingly an unschooling space within a school, which is located in Delhi. Another case study I'm looking at is called, or the project is called Swaraj University, which is a non-certified, non-deemed university who sorts of uses this university title mockingly and unofficially, which is mostly for young people aged 20 to 30 years. I'm looking at models of radical unschooling among families, which sees children and their parents together consciously making the choice to not go to school, so to not send the children to school, but learn with the family, with the broader community, with other unschoolers. And I'm also looking into what is called NOOCs, or self-designed learning centers. And this is the last part of my presentation, to give you just a brief overview of the NOOC self-designed learning center as one such alternative to mainstream education, which, as I argue, is based and acts out of the presupposition of equality. Now, before I talk a little bit more about these learning centers, I just want to show you a brief video, which just gives you a short idea of what such centers look like. So I'm just sharing my screen, and then you can hopefully see the video. Can I just get a heads up if anyone can see the video? Yeah. Okay. Here we go.
In schools, the teachers teach their own experience, but here we get to know what is our idea and we can implement it.
Class we get little bored, but teachers will be teaching us, will get bored. There won't be that fun, but here we are only browsing, we are only learning.
I'm not education degree now. I'm studying very 5th standard only. But I like a daily want to come, want to learn something, So just like a friends, we all enjoy. They're all little young children. They don't know any difference, age group or not.
Got her idea, yeah. She directly like fix the thing to the battery, so that like if she take out the battery, it will be like totally dismantled. Check whether it's working or not.
Yeah, it's working though.
Teachers, sometimes they may be tough, or we can't ask them doubts. Here, there's no doubts. Even if we have doubts also, we can ask someone and clarify, because all our friends here, we have that easygoing thing, because she's my friend, okay, I can ask her. If there is a teacher, there is some kind of fear, oh, she might scold me, oh, she might think something bad.
ಸೊ ಆ ಜಾಗ ಸೆಟಪ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಅದಾದಮೇಲೆ ನಾನೇನನ್ನ ಕಲಿಬೇಕಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಫ್ರೀಯಾಗೆ ಕಲ್ತ್ಬೋದು. ಆದರೆ ಒಂದು ವಿಷಯ ಏನಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಟೀಚರ್ಸ್ ಇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಮತ್ತೆ ಯಾರು ಗೈಡ್ಸ್ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ, ಅಂದರೆ ಆ ಜಾಗದ್ದು ನೋಡ್ಕೊತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಇನ್ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಅವ್ರು ಇರ್ತಾರೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಾವು ಯಾವ ಥರ ಕಲಿತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕ ನಾವು ಜನಗಳೇನಿರ್ತೀವಿ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ, ಒಂದು ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಥರ ಆಗ್ತೀವಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿ.
From battery acts as electrical energy and converts to mechanical energy, so that the wing rotates and produces air, and from here air comes.
I made one robot. So now second I'm trying to car. I want to make a car.
Because of the school surrounding, they allowed me to work here. So I said no, still I'll not get married till 1 year. I'll not get married. I'm trying them to say, but my mother's not listening. Girls should work, ma'am. They should not sit at home. Olden days they're saying, but now it is changed. All are equal. We should also work. We should stand on our foot. We should not depend on others for any of our cost. We should work, ma'am.
All right, I hope all of you could see and hear the video. So just to give you a visual impression of what such self-designed learning spaces look like. Now I know I have to be a bit conscious of time, so I'm trying to finish up in the next 5 to 10 minutes, if that's hopefully okay. But I just want to give you a brief overview of this model of learning, right, that is happening there in those learning centers. Now, how do such self-designed learning centers work? Basically, all the new learners who come, they will undergo a 2 months induction program, which is basically an introduction to self-designed learning. And self-designed learning basically means every learner, and it doesn't matter if they are 8 years old or 80 years old, every learner can decide on their own what is it that they want to learn, how they are going to learn it, and what they want to do with whatever they learned. Maybe just nothing, maybe they just do it out of fun, but it's up to them, and there are no exams, no grading system, and so on. So everything there is based on that idea of self-designed learning. And it starts with a 2 months induction program. What happens there is that learners get an overview of what is self-designed learning. They explore different sources of learning. One important source here is the internet. So giving them access to laptops, giving them access to internet. Mostly those centers are in areas of marginalized communities, so they usually don't have that access. They start by learning the very basics. How do I use a laptop? How do I find information online? How do I get access to the information I'm seeking for, and so on. Where do I find open and free online learning courses? How do I find YouTube tutorials for interesting projects, and so on. And then all the learners together, they build a variety of different projects. So usually those projects range from things such as urban farming to metalworks and carpentry to website development, 3D printing and 3D modeling, coding, programming, doing electronic robots, and a whole range of other things, even poetry, music, dance, and so on. So a very broad area of different skills and knowledge, which is what the learners then explore together in those first 2 months. Now, the idea behind that is specifically to break that mental barrier that was there often before in the learners, because coming especially from marginalized backgrounds, often those learners think that I can't really aspire to anything else than what my parents did in life. The best thing I can get is somewhere a job in the city, probably or in a factory or something like this. And there are a lot of things which they think they are simply not supposed to do. Part of it because they don't have access to the tools, to the resources, but also part because of how society thinks what a specific person from a
Christoph, we think we lost you. It looks like the connection went off. Maybe let me. His number. Looks like that connection on his side went. I hope it is a temporary issue.
Timo, can you come to the conference room? Actually, there we lost the internet connection.
Well, it looks like the connection is lost on his side, not on our side. I think on our side there is no particular lag or anything. So meanwhile, as we wait for the return of Christoph, we could maybe, in case people feel like asking a question, we could.
Can you phone him?
We don't have his number, but
The connection is from our side or from Christoph's side? Like we lost.
No, I think it's from Christoph's side because we can see.
Christoph will join
join.
Claudia's his number. I will check on the waiting list if it's here.
Sent.
In the meantime, you can ask him.
If he's not here, those I was saying that those who are interested in asking him a question can write it in the chat box.
Hi, he's trying to join, but I think you have to let him in. Yeah.
Hi, sorry.
Hi, Christoph, you are back.
Yeah, that was probably a sign that I should stop soon, but it was just a power cut here, so sorry about that. Give me 5 more minutes to finish. So
if you could wrap it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that we could move to the questions.
Definitely. So I was just going to talk about that induction program, which again, you can see is very much based on the presupposition of equality, which is what I'm arguing in my book, where the learners try out a lot of different things and where that sort of mental barriers are being broken, that when learners usually think they are not able to do those things, they're not supposed to do those things. And so on. And after this induction program, what happens is that there is a 3 months long goal cycle for all of the learners. Now, all of the learners will decide before this goal cycle starts, what do they want to do for a project over the next 3 months. And this follows a specific procedure where the goals have to be relevant to their own lives. It has to be some skill and knowledge which they want to use in the local community to improve their livelihoods, to improve community life, and so on. So something that is very much relevant to them. And this is how basically this model works, and in a very short summary. And in my book, I detail, of course, how all this follows the presupposition of equality, and then also how this takes hold among the learners. So I spoke to a lot of the learners there, and they are very conscious of how what they have learned, how this not only relates to that particular project that they did, but how this also has expanded their radical imagination of what they want to do, what kind of work they also are capable to do, what kind of skills they want to acquire. What actually it helps them also to find out what kind of interests do I have, what kind of dreams do I have, what aspirations do I have, and how can I follow them. And so I argued that this is one of the cases, one of the projects based on the presupposition of equality, which basically can help us to think out of the box, to come up with new solutions for the pressing problems we have. Now, I don't want to overstate, so it's not happening overnight that some said that all those people suddenly become revolutionaries and give up their old lifestyles and so on.
We have lost you, Christoph. Christoph?
What happens and what I could observe is more that. Okay, I think I got cut again, so I'll wrap it up here. What I was saying is that in the end, I don't want to overstate that initiatives such like this are always basically immediately making people into revolutionaries, always and at very fast speed, turning them away from their lifestyle choices and so on. What happens is more that this takes hold gradually, right? The presupposition of equality takes hold in people on a very gradual, on a long-term process. It basically relates just to that idea that I am much more capable than maybe what society, what also the modern education system is telling me what I should do or what I can do. And this is a very long-term process where the people bit by bit start to question those sort of introduced hierarchies, start to question, why do I have to do that? Why do I need to listen always and only to expert advice, to authorities, to institutions who are telling me what I should do with my life? How can I take control? How can I take charge of my own life? Which is basically what Rancière calls a process of subjectification, which is gradually taking hold. So I want to end it with that. And yeah, sorry that I took quite a bit more time. But I hope I could get across some of the main points, and then happy to discuss more about some of the other case studies I mentioned or any other questions that you have.
Thank you, Christoph, for your wide-ranging presentation and your theoretical effort also to bridge to bridge your case study with also larger discussion on equality, and the work of Rancière, for instance, is quite fascinating. I'm sure that there will be questions from the audience, but while people collect their thought, maybe I will have a couple of questions for you, Christoph. First, don't you think that there is a paradoxical feature in alternative education, particularly in India, as it attempts to strike a better or more striking form of equality, but at the same time, this kind of alternative schooling is always addressed to a particular upper class of the society, and the possibility of thinking of an alternative model for a lot of parents and students is possible only within a particularly privileged section of the population. So isn't there a contradiction in the terms here? Alternative education wants more equality, but access to this kind of institutions are not at all equal, to say the least. A second, I wanted to ask you whether you cover a little bit how choice of schooling was made, and how this alternative schooling fares in terms of decisions of enrolling kids as compared to other form of education, in particular public schools in rural areas. And of course, how would you map this alternative schooling in India, geographically, but also in terms of the competition within the alternative systems, or the alternative models of alternative education, Montessori and being one of them, but there are so many. So I was wondering if you could throw some insight into this.
Right. Thanks. I think some good questions. So I'll start with your first question. And this is really a question which I often have faced and also was thinking around a lot. And I think there are two important things to consider here. The first is alternative education really only something for the rich, or let's say for the more privileged, and how could it be made into a real alternative for the ones who are not that privileged? Now, first of all, in my book, I show a whole range of case studies of how unschooling, how self-designed learning is used. When it comes to what I have termed radical unschooling among families, then you're right, like what we can see there is mostly middle class and upper middle class families doing that. Why? Because obviously you need access to many things, right? You need access to resources, to a whole network of friends, other unschooling families, relatives, to people who could potentially act as mentors for your children. You need some money to do traveling around, which a lot of unschooling families are doing. You need access to a whole range of resources, right? But in other case studies, for instance, specifically that what I was talking about, those NUC self-learning centers, they are specifically targeted for marginalized communities. And so what I'm also arguing is that, yes, things like unschooling, like self-learning and so on, they can only become a real alternative if we actually have a lot more of such and similar spaces, which basically bundle what Ivan Illich has called the elements of the learning web, right? So which provide access to resources, which provide mentorship opportunities, which create networks, and so on. So without that, it's not possible. You can't just say just because a person doesn't go to school, they are doing unschooling, right? That's not true. It's actually an effort. There needs to be a platform, and there needs to be free access to it. And so we definitely need much more of those spaces. And on the other side, I think, which you also were mentioning, is this actually even feasible for less privileged people who struggle often on a daily basis to make ends meet and so on, right? So here what I feel is, again, we also need to look at what is actually the outcome of the mainstream education sector, particularly schooling. Has schooling actually ever been that silver bullet that development makes out of it, right? Has education, mainstream schooling especially, ever been an equalizer, so to speak? And if we look at the statistics, we can see that this is actually clearly not the case. Like globally, we have unprecedented access to mainstream education, especially on the elementary and secondary school level. It does not translate into reduced poverty levels, into reduced inequality levels. And that equation that once you get a school degree, you get a job, this is certainly not true anymore, if it ever has been. So the question is just, does schooling actually help those underprivileged? And my argument in the book is also that it rather cements existing inequalities. And then we can ask, okay, aren't there any alternatives to it? And again, I'm not saying that this alternative learning all of a sudden solves poverty, solves all our problems, right? It's also a long-term process, but it can give also people from marginalized communities a much more holistic education. It can help them to find or to acquire skills and knowledge that are really relevant to them in their individual circumstances, depending on their individual needs, on their particular dreams, aspirations, and so on. And so that's why I'm thinking we have to be more open for those approaches. One, because schooling doesn't really work for the poor, and secondly, because alternative education, while not offering another silver bullet solution, it can offer a lot more in terms of getting relevant skills and knowledge, and really is like in the case of those NUC learning centers, it's a very community-based education that everyone can get access to, and everyone can decide what they want to learn instead of following that top-down schooling model. Does that address the first part of your question?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So maybe moving to the second part.
Right. The second part. So so one was about, is there competition between, or what does that competition look like between alternative schools and so on, I think. So here, I mean, I have not looked at this kind of Montessori schools or even free schools like Riverside and all that. I have focused more particularly on what are unschooling and self-designed learning initiatives, which are not kind of formal schools, but which are mostly organized platforms and spaces and projects. So actually, what I felt is that a lot of them are actually very much connected with each other and don't really see them as competition. Like a lot of them are, I think about 50 to 60 organizations that are doing this in India are organized in what is called the Indian Multiversities Alliance, which do a lot of networking, which do a lot of collaboration, and so on. So I haven't really seen any much aspect of competition. And again, I think for competition to even take place, there would be the need for much more of those spaces, right? So again, in that Multiversities Alliance, we're talking about 50 to 60 spaces, which are particularly focused on unschooling. And yeah, to give you an idea of the scale of it, so apart from those organizations, there are maybe by now, from what I heard as estimations, maybe 10,000 to 15,000 families in India who are practicing radical unschooling together. So that in terms of the scale of it. Was there anything else related to that part of the question?
If you had some, some insight from the ground or some data or some, something a bit more specific about the mapping of this kind of alternative schools, so that we can put images beyond your case study to help those who don't have a particular knowledge of alternative education in India, to just get a sense of who are the players, who is there, something in which we could have a more vivid picture about what is happening, and who attend the school in sociological terms.
Right. Okay. So one part is like I have said, that kind of unschooling which is practiced among families, it's mostly based for the reasons I mentioned by middle class and upper class families. And yeah, a lot of spaces, they are also catering to those. At times, they will also use fees to finance themselves. And I've seen places which have 1 to 2 years programs of unschooling, of self-learning, for which you, of course, if you do it full-time, you need to have the privilege to actually take 2 years out of your schedule and follow that. And even then, a lot of them will struggle a bit to get reintegrated, so to speak, into the life outside, right? So until a lot of them will start to do their own projects. They will do green entrepreneurship projects. They will do things around arts. They will do manifold, like sustainable clothing. I mean, it's very broad, but of course, all of this takes time. And to start something like this, definitely you need to have some privileges. But then there are, like I said, many spaces also, such as the NUC self-learning centers, such as the Creativity Ada in Delhi, and which is also elsewhere in the country, which works particularly with marginalized communities. And so those are mostly programs which people can join at any time, right? They don't have to be there full time. They can take out 2-3 hours every day to come there. They don't even have to come every day. And so those programs are much more flexible. So it builds a routine for the learners to come to gradually get a hold of that presupposition of equality, right? And so there are both those kind of spaces catering to different strata of society, I would say.
Much we have 2 questions from the audience. Dr. Parajita Sarkar and our director Nicolas Gavel have raised their hand, so we are very grateful for their interest. Would you like to Parajita first, maybe, and Nicolas just after
Nicolas
ask
can
your
go
questions?
first. It's fine. Nicolas can go first.
Okay, so Nicolas, would you like to step in?
Yes, I can do that, certainly. I mean, thank you for this talk. I mean, it's obviously an interesting topic. I mean, however, there are a few things which obviously can be discussed in your approach. I mean, for one thing, concerning a country like India, where still 30% of the adult population is illiterate, and where, whenever there are some evaluation of what people know at school, let's say through PISA studies, the last PISA studies to which India participated was in 2009, and the India standing at that, as appraised by the 2 best performing states, was that India was ranked just above the Kyrgyzstan and behind the Dominican Republic in terms of what the kids from India knows at the age of 15. And here we talk about basic knowledge. We don't talk about attitude toward capitalism or things like that. We talk about basic knowledge, reading, doing simple mathematical operation, all of that. India has performed quite badly. And so in a country like India, where the issue is the complete lack of education of a significant fraction of its population, a priori, I would say it's a bit revolutionary or challenging that you call for a deschooling process or alternative schooling in a country that doesn't even have a proper schooling system to begin with. So I would say, before talking about how to teach well and better, which is very important, I would first put my priority, at least many people will tell you that, to first teach and provide this basic schooling to the population. I mean, India is far behind a lot of countries on that. It's far behind its Chinese neighbor, and it's really a big thing. And so that's something which, I would like to have your view on. And another view, which I think I was a bit surprised to hear, but perhaps you can make it more precise, was that you seem to be saying that education, as it is done let's say in developed country, or let's call them capitalist countries, since you use that term, is a creator of inequality. Well, all the evidence that we have on that, I mean, and of course, one can question some of this methodology, but it's one of the most robust and systematic evidence, is that countries where the population is highly educated and where the inequality in education, I'm not talking about inequality in income, where the inequality in education are the lowest, that is to say, a lot of people are educated, are the countries where the income is the most equally distributed. And I'm talking here about the Scandinavian countries. So there is a tight link between what you know at school and education and your income, or whatever, you know, measure of success and lack that you want to think of. And educating people, providing them basic education and good education, is one of the main source of economic success. So if you educate everybody at the highest possible term, you're going to reduce inequality, and you cannot increase them. And I've never seen any solid study which have shown that high education is creating inequality. What creates inequality, at least in the developed countries, is the inequality in education. But education, very often, at least in most studies I'm aware, and there are like thousands of them, education increase income, and therefore reducing education inequality, reduce income inequality. So I just would like to have your view of that. Perhaps I misunderstood what you were saying.
No, thanks for those questions. To start with your first one, so I think if I understood you right, what you also say and what we agree on is that the kind of school-based education in India, as we see, doesn't work, right? Even the basic skills are not there. Now, I would rather think of it in these terms. So if that doesn't work in schools, which the evidence clearly shows, are there other ways to do it? And I think although it is called unschooling, that doesn't mean you have to go through school first to do it, right? It's just the name. Think of it more in terms of self-learning or self-designed learning. And what I have seen from my observations is that even in self-designed learning models, people are able to acquire very basic skills if they don't have it. For instance, think of it in those NOOC self-learning centers, or even in the creativity others I have visited. What happens is basically that the learners come up with their own project, which might be to build a robot, which might be something like, I want to become a carpenter and I want to make a table, right? For all that, what you need is basic skills such as math, such as geometry, you need basic literacy, and so on. So I think it just works different how you acquire those skills, right? Whereas in schooling, you basically get abstract knowledge where you often don't know how to apply it or how to use it, and it's based on rote learning, memorization, and so on, which I would say is part of the problem. In self-learning, the thing is you choose something on your own, what interests you, and for that you need to acquire specific skills, right? And those skills require you to also have some basic skills. I mean, examples I have seen were, for instance, that when people come to those self-learning centers, which are often on the rural side, they often don't have any English language skills, right? But most of the sources, at least when they go online to find projects, to get tutorials on how to do their project and so on, most of them will be in English language. And what I have seen is that within 3 to 4 months, those learners who didn't speak any kind of English, they will acquire a very basic vocabulary and capacity of speaking English. And I would say same goes for other things. If you have a project, like I said, on other areas, you might acquire basic math skills and so on, right? Even if you do urban gardening, urban farming, also on you need specific skills for it in maths and biology and other things, right? Just that often we don't really see them as knowledge because it is not dedicatedly and separately studied as a school subject, but it comes with the rest. So I think that is maybe also a model which can help people. Again, of course, then you can say it doesn't go so much in the breadth, it goes more in the depth, because if you focus on a particular project, you only learn those particular traits and knowledge associated with it. But then you also have the possibility to work on other projects and so on, and you will get into other areas, right? So that's why I would say, maybe even for that issue that you mentioned, people don't have even the basic skills. Maybe self-learning could at least play a complementary role here. And the other question is, so I think what I mean that education has never been a great equalizer. I can't pinpoint right now an exact name of a study, but there are lots of studies which actually show, even in developed countries, that the level of education that you get is very much tied to your socio-economic background, right? And I think I'm referring more to that yes, if you get the right education, then it will help you, but most people don't get the right education. And the question here is also, especially in countries like India, we have a multi-tier level system, right? We have those elite public schools, as well as you have those completely underfunded, almost defunct public schools. You have fancy private schools for the poor, you have good private schools for the middle class, you have even private schools for the poor, and so on. So the question is it actually politically desired to have an equal education system, right? Given that we live in this neoliberal development model where you are dependent on a labor force that is doing jobs at the lowest level, right? So it doesn't seem there is the political will to equalize that system. And that is more what I was referring to. And the education system as it is today in India, but also elsewhere, the structure it has today, that's why I'm saying it is not a tool for equality.
Stuff, we have the time for two questions. Maybe Aprajita, if you would like to go in, and then Priyanka will do a follow up with her own questions after you, Aprajita, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah. Sorry, my video is off. I find your framework really interesting for understanding the structural problems of education. I did find like your emphasis on primary or basic education. What happens even in these alternate systems that you're describing? What happens to the more abstract expertise knowledge that comes from in the higher classes? And what happens to this technicalization of education, where you are told all the basic stuff, you're told how to be smart in life and actually get skills for it? And I'm talking about the alternate system that you described. And what if the person opts for, let's say, higher education in humanities, for instance? Or I was just looking for such descriptions and analysis of choices that someone makes in the higher end as they go into the higher classes, and thereby career choices. Thanks.
Right, thanks. Okay, so the first question, what happens to the what we can call maybe more abstract or higher advanced kind of knowledge? So to a certain degree, of course, those spaces, those alternative learning spaces, can enable the learners to dive more deep into things, right? Especially because so all those self-learning spaces are basically focused on project-based learning, right? Which means you have the time in the MOOC self-learning centers, for instance, for 3 months each, and then you can do another cycle and so on. So you have the time to really dive deep into things, and wherever knowledge is really accessible, you can use it, right, in those centers, and you can also get into more abstract knowledge, and you get the time to do that, I would say. Of course, at some point, I mean, if you want to become a physician, if you want to become a vet or something, there's only like so much you can do, right? There's always on some level of knowledge, of skills that you can acquire through those free spaces. And then after a certain level, of course, if you have explored all opportunities, how you can further pursue this, then you might have already the necessary knowledge to say then, okay, I am going for further education, or I am finding mentorship opportunities in my local community or elsewhere. So the whole idea of those of this idea of unschooling or self-designed learning is also to create a whole network or a whole community, right, of resources, of knowledge, and so on, which you can tap into. And that doesn't mean that unschooling or self-learning says you should never do formal education, it's something bad, right? It's not considered something bad. It's just considered that it is something which is there for a specific purpose, and you should have the choice to pursue this if you want to. And if you think this is the best way to get your knowledge, then by all means go for it. But you can also explore a lot of other options, right? You can also explore a lot of other avenues, and instead of only gaining abstract or higher level knowledge through books or through teachers, maybe there are other ways, right? Maybe you can tap into your neighborhood community or the broader community of self-learners who have experience on that level. Maybe you can find open resource online courses. Maybe you can create your own course around it, right? Or maybe you can pursue further education or other options, right? Again, the whole idea is of not limiting the way of how learning and education happens, but broadening it and giving the people more options, not taking away options from them. I think this was the first part, and the second part, can you repeat a little bit where you were going at in terms of higher education? Like, were you asking if people from self-designed learning sources are going into higher education, or what was the question?
I just, yeah, if you can give, if there are examples, great. But I was essentially asking just one question about higher education and access to, like, when you say mentors, who's going to mentor someone into like a very esoteric field? I mean, what are the, that is also a form of limiting education, right? Where you're limiting the imagination of a person and what that person expects from higher education. So that's all. I guess that's what I wanted to problematize. Thanks.
I think so. There are examples which I have seen where learners who never went to school or went out of school and then started unschooling and so on, they went to higher education. There are universities, especially in the Western countries, ironically, then in that case, which do accept learners who don't have the formal degrees. There are also ways for alternative learners or unschoolers in the Indian system to get their certification, even if they are not at school, to do those tests and do those exams. This is also done by some of those unschoolers. And from another side, I think what, for instance, so I am involved myself also in some projects of self-learning now. And for instance, in a project in Bangladesh that we are running, we are trying to create partnerships with the higher education sector, right? Partnerships in the sense of that the college, the university offers open access workshops where our learners can go, that we get mentors from there who are doing some hands-on workshops with our learners in the learning centers and so on. And I think this is also one way in the future to not only say it's either alternative education or higher education, but how can higher education be more open to find collaborations with alternative education places and also to integrate some of those things, right? So for instance, even myself, when I did my PhD and also gave some lectures, I've tried to include project-based learning and those approaches into my teaching, right? So there are ways how you can actually also work with the higher education sector. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christoph. Actually, I just would like to know something. In Delhi, near ITO, there is a one center, Bal Bhavan, where they are giving children to some specific training, or as you say, alternative activity like aeronautic or some engineering stuff or some content writing and all. So I found myself very interested to send my child over there, but I think and I was thinking and nowadays he's learning robotic and coding, but I just have a question, how if a child has an interest on this particular activity and he would like to continue and would like to make his own career on that particular theme, yeah, that's alternative school is very good option, because from the childhood they are trained like a student, children to make their own career. But in India, it's I think it's how they evaluate children, when they start looking up for going somewhere or going to the MNCs to get the job. So how they evaluate. So I always interesting to get enroll my son in robotic and coding, and he's doing fine, but the study is like a more priority. I said you have to study first, then you can go to the alternative classes, because I cannot fully depend as a parents. I'm talking as a parents, I cannot send my child on only just to alternative study.
I mean, see, it's a choice, and it's a very bold choice. So there are parents who are taking that decision because they have gone through that whole schooling experience. They don't believe that their kids will be happy in school, and they don't believe that they will get the knowledge that would actually help them later on in life. But it's of course, so if you would decide to do that, it's a very let's say bold decision, right? It's socially not very common, not very accepted. I talked to many unschooling families who were telling me even their relatives, their
For
friends, they look
Montessori,
upon them a little bit.
yeah, I did not send my child as a for Montessori till 5-6 years he was at home, and I was only one, and the parents they can get the classes at home. But I think in India, the pay as a parents, they are interesting. Yes, it's a bold decision, as you say. And maybe the parents are not very courageous because they feel that there is a lot of competition in India. And so...
I mean, I get that the question is how can you change that model, right? So the whole point of my endeavor was to sort of think about how can we think beyond development, right? And the question is, okay, if we are always saying that, hey, because the current model is as it is, then we send our kids to school, we do the same that we did it 30, 40, 50 years ago. So our kids get a chance in that current model, right? Or is our perspective that we're saying this current model we have right now is not very sustainable, it's not very feasible. I don't even know if it will exist by the time my children will finish school, right? And is that why I choose to do unschooling, to do self-learning and focus more on these, right? So it's a very conscious choice, and it's a very bold choice to make, of course.
Yes, I think so. It's a very choice, and then but although if the children are happy to learn and to want to get it, so why not? We have to change our mentality, and then I think parents should take a step. If
I mean, the interesting thing what I have seen in my evaluation of the children, of the teenagers who are doing unschooling, it's not that like many would fear, oh my God, if I don't send my kid to school, then they will just watch TV all day and not learn a single thing, right? I was actually very impressed by the kind of knowledge that they have. Again, it might not be as broad as what they would learn in school, but it is much more in-depth. Apart from that, what I noticed the difference was a lot of difference in behavior, like children who were doing unschooling for a long time. I felt they are much more self-confident, much more expressive, much more communicative, and also
Yes,
much
yes.
more happy in what they are doing. Yeah.
I agree on that point. Like, I just wanted to ask, like, how they evaluate. Like, if I just quit study, like in a class 6 or 7, and I enroll somewhere according to his interest. So, is it recognized like after 2 years, or like where
So
he?
I think, I mean, you have to differentiate. So what I'm talking about, those kind of spaces, it's not like they will just offer you a coding class and then you do it, right? Those spaces are really there for the learner to discover what do I want to do, and then help them to do it. They don't offer like formal classes or something like this. I think this is again something else. And in terms of certification, how it works for those self-learning spaces, I looked at. So this is actually one of those challenges, which I think there is still lots of work to be done. So also some of the learners were telling me they have a lot of skills, they have a lot of knowledge, but it's not recognized, right? Especially when they are younger children and they have a lot of skills. They were telling me, I tell this and this person I have those many skills, they don't even believe me because I don't have a certificate to prove it. And so the idea here is I think that you introduce much more documentation around it. So you have a project portfolio, for instance, which you can show. You find experts in your area of knowledge and you ask them, can you have a look at this? Can you write me an evaluation? And you have a living portfolio of things, right? Most often they are hands-on projects that those learners doing, so they can show those things, right? So they do develop a portfolio, but yes, there is a challenge that there is no formal degree as such. And because the learning there is so individual, like everyone is doing something else, every other learner is doing another area of learning, doing another project, it will be difficult to have that kind of certification. And the question is again, does it make sense to have that? Because especially that kind of grading, that kind of only looking for the degree but not what they learn, is part of the problem of modern education. But yeah, that is some challenge that alternative learning spaces would face definitely.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, thank you so much, Christoph, for a wonderful talk. And I give it to Jean-Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Christophe, for being there for our last speaker of the year. We're quite honored, and thank you for such rich presentation. I'm sure everyone has something to take home now and to think about in terms of education. So I propose that we bring that to a close and invite all the people who are here to reconvene next academic year. Stick with us. CSH would be looking for you next year. And thank you once again, Dr. Christophe Neusdil. It was really a great pleasure, and hope to see you in Delhi whenever you're
Yes, once the
pass by.
situation allows, definitely I'll come over.
Wonderful. Thank you once again, and have a great evening, and hope to see people soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for
Bye.
joining.
Bye.
Bye.